I'd like to take you through another game from Wesley So. And this one, I think, demonstrates his superb strategic understanding. So far, I've looked at games that were suggested by you, my patrons and viewers and subscribers. But this one is my own choice. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. And do consider supporting us via Patreon or PayPal. You'll find the links in the video description. So this game was played in the Gibraltar Masters in 2019. Over the board chess, seems like a long time ago. And Wesley has played into the Sveshnikov. And it's interesting to see what system he chooses. Of course, the old main lines were with bishop g5, but he follows the line that Caruana played against Carlsen in the World Championship match in 2018, just a couple of months before this. And, I never really considered this a great threat to the Sveshnikov when I was playing the Sveshnikov in, the 1970s and 1980s. So it was one of my first kind of favourite openings to play as black. But it's very interesting to see that Wesley has selected this. He is a really good theoretician. He works very, very hard on his opening preparation. And I think we're going to see this in this game. He's obviously studied the World Championship match games very carefully. So we have this typical situation in this line where black has a kingside pawn majority and will often try to use that to advance an attack on the king side, and white has the queenside pawn majority and will try to use that space advantage perhaps to make a breakthrough with c4, c5, or perhaps simply just to cramp black on the queen side. Bishop d2. So this is all as in one of the World Championship games. And here, Wesley's opponent, I should say Daniel Sadzikowski from Poland, Polish Grandmaster, played f5. There's also another way of playing this position. This was demonstrated, for example, in a game between Svidler and Grishuk that went like this. And now a5. This is very interesting. Although moving the a pawn to a5 gives away the b5 square, it does stop white expanding with a5 himself. In any case, that didn't happen here. Pawn to f5 and a5. So you can see white claiming that space. We'll see later on how important this can be. Now, in one of the World Championship games, Caruana against Carlsen, there was a very exciting battle happened after a6. I should say in our game, we're about to look at f4, but in that World Championship game, then this happened. So you can see that Carlsen is developing the kingside initiative, but Caruana fought back with f4. And then succeeded in actually pushing through with c5 and actually achieved a very good position, although he missed the right way forward. But this was probably Caruana's best chance of a victory in the match, this game. So you can see that both sides are pushing their pawns forward, and there's kind of tension where those plates, it's like shifting tectonic plates, I always think. And there's tension in the middle where, they meet, basically. Let's go back. So instead of a6, in this game, Sadzikowski played f4. Now, in principle, I rather like this pawn chain. The pawn on f4, you can see it claims the e3 square. It carves out territory on the king side, opens up this diagonal. There's the possibility perhaps to push forward with f3. And it prevents white from playing f4 himself, which would sort of blunt or can blunt the kingside attack. So there's a lot to like about this pawn chain. You often see it in the King's Indian, of course. Of course, a downside is that light square here on e4 is weakened. But at the moment, well, it's difficult for white to occupy that. And in any case, black can cover that square with perhaps knight f6, perhaps bishop f5 later. I mean, a very crude way for black to play this position would be to shift the rook to the h file. But that's sometimes possible in similar King's Indian positions, actually. So it's a very interesting idea to set up this pawn chain. Let's see how Wesley deals with it. How would you deal with it? Just pause the video for a moment. Have a little think. White to play. Would you be terrified after black played f4? Well, Wesley very calmly played the rook to e1. Yeah. Okay, very cool indeed. Now, there is a precedent. In one particular game, black played like this. And the knight switched around to looking at b6 and c5 squares. Still a very double-edged position. But here, Sadzikowski played knight f6, which also looks reasonable, looking at d5, looking at e4, opening up this diagonal for the bishop. Bishop d3 from Wesley. Very cool, just putting his bishop on this nice diagonal, preventing black playing bishop f5 himself. And now this is a big moment in the game. How should black try to develop the kingside attack? Well, first of all, I should say knight takes d5 would lead to disaster after bishop c4, so that's not on. a6 is always to be considered. You know, at some point this knight will probably have to be expelled. And then g5 is possible. And rook f7, you know, just play this very crudely and try to push these pawns. But in the meantime, of course, white is going to try and break with c5. Does black have time to actually get the kingside attack going? That's not clear. As we saw before in the Caruana-Carlsen game, the c5 break is actually very annoying. And look where that rook is. Just eyeing up the pawn on e5. So, you know, the big problem when you advance the pawns in front of your king is that there's a big vacuum created behind, a big hole created. And if white does break through, then the king could lack protection. And again, there are a lot of pieces around black's king, so, you know, who knows what could happen there, but a really double-edged situation. So back to this position. There's the position in the game. Bishop d3 just played. Black played f3, a very interesting move. Trying to disturb white's kingside. And at this point, you know, if you were playing white, you would need to calculate very carefully and have, well, really good judgment of what's coming up next in the position. White can capture this pawn in two different ways. In fact, although this looks pretty ugly, this is possible actually. And then just put the king in the corner and rook g1. Now, obviously, black has compensation here in the form of, you know, this rook looking at the f file and, you know, knight f4. And then again, white is still in the game. That's possible. If Wesley, you know, didn't like the look of the other continuation, that is possible. But he judged that queen f3 was okay. But there's a lot of calculation now. Knight g4. Opening up the f file, looking at the queen. And looking through to the pawn on f2. If the queen retreats, then rook takes f2 is already good for black. So where should that queen go? If queen h3, in fact, white doesn't get anywhere. The knight retreats, attacking the queen, and actually the queen doesn't really have a very safe square to go to. I mean, the position could be repeated, but, you know, that's nothing special. Wesley had judged that queen e4 was a good move. Now, if g6, then just f3 and white is just a pawn up. Bishop f5 is the only move which really it seeks to unsettle white. So black looking to exchange bishops after the queen moves and then take on f2. But here is where Wesley's judgment came into play. He appreciated that he could sacrifice his queen. And he has superb compensation. Having got rid of that light squared bishop, this bishop just rules these light squares. And very important that it controls these key squares, controls c8, the rook can't move there, controls d7, the queen can't hop out. Also gains tempo against the knight, which is useful. So for example, well, it's possible just to play knight f6, but bishop e3, two wonderful bishops. White is in control here. White has a rook and a bishop and one pawn against the queen. So actually there's material parity, but actually from a positional point of view, very pleasant for white. Now, there is still a very long way to go to win this game. Nevertheless, great compensation. And the same in the game. a6 played, hoping to bat away the knight. But Wesley took on d6. So it's just making sure that he wins a pawn now. Queen takes and bishop takes. Well, in fact, he doesn't quite win a pawn because black can take on d5. Bishop c3 attacks pawn on e5, which was defended, and then bishop f3. Okay, let's take stock. No, Wesley didn't win a pawn, but he still does have an extra pawn. So what's happening here? Black has managed to exchange a couple of pieces. Normally one would think that's good in this kind of situation. But in fact, White's position is so stable here. This is, if you're playing with pieces against the queen, in this case a rook and a bishop, what you need is a stable position without any weaknesses, and this is what White has. So let's look at these bishops. Both protected by pawns. They can't be attacked. There are no weaknesses in White's pawn position. Perfect pawns. The rooks are connected and protected. We like that. In other words, of course, very important, the king is completely secure. So in other words, there is nothing for the queen to attack. This is crucial. Queens need targets. Queens are deadly when they're attacking a lone exposed king. They're deadly when they find a loose piece, a minor piece, say, that isn't protected, or a weak pawn. Here, there is nothing for the queen to attack. Now, in such situations, it's crucial that White actually maintains coordination and makes sure that everything remains protected. In the immortal words of Boris Spassky, you have to play like an oil tanker. And that is something that Wesley is very good at. Rook e4. Blockading this one. Perhaps lining up, preparing doubling rooks, but just a good blockade. So make sure that the pawn can't move and that bishop remains poorly placed behind the pawn. Rook d8. Black activates the rook. g3. There's no rush. Let's just solve the back rank problem. The king, of course, protected by the bishop, is secure on g2 if it were to move there. Queen c5. And now rook a4. Very nice. Connecting the rooks again. And this reminds me of course, one of the games in the final against Magnus from the Schilling Open. If you remember, Wesley managed to line up his rooks and queen along the fourth rank. In fact, that was also in this same variation of the Sveshnikov. It occurs to me now. I mean, that's just a pure coincidence. But yeah, they're connected, and they're about to move to c4. There we go. Rook a c4. Because the back rank is covered, then there's no danger in moving these rooks, I beg your pardon, to the 4th rank. So the queen is attacked. Moves back. Rook c8. And now he moves in. The rook comes back. Generally, when you have the queen against pieces in this kind of situation, you would be desperate to exchange rooks. But in fact, it doesn't make any odds here. White threatens to bring the rook down to c7, and there's also a threat to potentially take on d8, and bishop takes b7. You can see that pawn on a5 is doing a superb job, as it so often does in this variation. It cramps those 2 pawns, and b7 is obviously a big target here. So that's what Wesley is aiming for. So if rook takes rook, then bishop d5 check wins immediately. There we go, the king is stuck on the back rank. Back to the game position. Rook c4 just played. And now pawn to e4. So black is desperate to break out, to exchange pieces in the hope that something will turn up. Perhaps he's hoping that after the exchange of bishops, then maybe a5 and b2 could be vulnerable. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. Rook takes. And g6. So black solves the back rank problem, gives the king a square on g7, a dark square, of course, stepping away from that light squared bishop. Bishop takes b7. Thank you very much. That pawn drops. I don't think there's anything that black could do about that. Of course, if queen takes bishop, then rook takes rook check, and the 2 rooks will win the day. Queen e1 check, king g2. Rooks are exchanged, and king g7. So you might say that black has achieved something there in exchanging those rooks, but actually, well, white is still in control. But this is a crucial moment in the game where you can see that the pieces are slightly loose. So really important to hold everything together. Don't create any weaknesses. c3 is a good start. Stops the queen taking on a5. Queen e2 threatens that one. No problem, we'll advance that, and the rook protects the pawn, so that's a nice pawn chain. The only piece which is loose is that bishop. But it's hard for the queen to exploit that in any way. The bishop can always drop back, and the rook is secure. It's very important that there are no random checks against the king. That diagonal is covered by the bishop. h5. A last hope to try to just create some little opening on the king side using that pawn. Perhaps coming down to h3. Perhaps, if white's tempted, then the position opens and then the queen has some checks. But no. Rook c7. Check. King h6. Bang. That one is shut. No chance of that pawn advancing. And what can black do here? He played g5 again with a last hope to try to open the king, white's king. What would happen if white waited? So, for example, what about random move? Queen e5, hitting the rook. Rook c5, everything protected. Okay, the queen goes back, maintaining protection over the pawn here. Bishop f3, let's hit the queen. Queen e7, okay, let's play rook c6 and attack the pawn. So you notice everything is protected, everything is still covered. It's a beautiful position to play. And after queen a7, then black is just overloaded. So the queen had to protect the a-pawn, and now we just switch to the next weakness, g6. Once that's taken, then, well, that one drops and everything is dropping there. So you can see that white is still able to target weaknesses in the position. Black played g5. Now we just got to think, how do we just keep control? Bishop f3 attacks the queen. Queen b5. And rook c5 was the final move of the game. Attacking the queen and also attacking the pawn on g5. So why did black resign here? Let's just continue for a little bit. So for example, queen moves, queen d3. We take another pawn, thank you. Still got to watch out for h4. That could be a little bit disruptive. But actually, well, it's way too slow. b5. Now we can make a dash towards the queening square. a6. Rook c6 check. Well, if the king goes back, then you can see that black is going to be caught on the 7th rank and the pawn will advance. If king f5, then let's do this. g6. I mean, basically one of these pawns is going to go through. Rook g5, and that one goes through, and there's going to be a bishop d5 check at the end of it to make sure that that pawn goes right through to g8. And coming back here, king takes g5. Well, we can even catch the king in a mating net. Let's just see that. a7. Black has to take that. Check. And g4 mate. I like to finish the games with a checkmate. It's all very neat. There we go. So maybe you can say not Wesley's most difficult win, but I think it really shows his great strategic judgment and how impressively he controls the game, and his excellent preparation. I am sure that he had looked at those World Championship games very, very closely, and interesting to see him go through that again. Thanks very much for watching.